We're gonna great, and this is being recorded. Great, so I'm gonna kick it off by introducing myself, and then I'll pass it to my co-facilitator, George. So my name is Belinda Rodriguez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a community organizer and trainer. Um, in 2014, I co-founded a project called Momentum that supports organizers to plan decentralized campaigns that can escalate to scale and win. I'm originally from Miami, and I currently live in Baltimore, where I organize for housing justice with a wonderful organization called Housing Our Neighbors. And with that, I will pass it to my co-facilitator, George.
Thank you, Belinda. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Before I introduce our co-panelists, our speaker biographies, just to share a little bit about myself, I'm a first-generation popular educator, organic scholar, and researcher. I've been navigating professional, deprofessionalized spaces since 2010 in various different capacities, teaching at public school systems to organizing people's assemblies, and now working at a participatory budgeting project as a curriculum design specialist. I've been also writing and teaching. I'm currently holding a visiting postdoc position and have also been involved with the Municipalism Cohort, which we'll be hearing about a little bit later from Mason. And before I hand it over to Belinda, who's going to give us an overview and a kind of a rundown of the work we carry out here at SRC, I'd like to talk a little bit about our speakers today. So today we're joined by a great panel of speakers who will be presenting on their different areas of work. First off, it's Anastasia Wilson, who's an academic and teaches courses on political economy. She's earned a PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst with a dissertation on political economy of carceral schooling, and is a facilitator with the Center for Popular Economics. Her current research examines the enmeshment of social reproduction, care work, and carceral systems. She is interested in workers' inquiry, which is a method in thinking about care in, against, and beyond capitalism. She enjoys learning new skills, riding bikes, and building community. We're also joined by Andrew Curley, who's a member of the Navajo Nation and an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at the University of Arizona. He studies coal and development in the Navajo Nation. His latest publications highlight the consequence of colonial water laws on indigenous nations and the political economy of green transition within reservation economies. His work is on extraction, energy, and notions of resource curse among tribal governments. We also have Jess Forden. Jess is a researcher whose work uses both quantitative and qualitative analysis to support policies and initiatives that improve outcomes for marginalized communities and pushes for an economy based in inclusion and collaboration. She is a research associate with the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis at the New School, and she is also a PhD student in economics. Her recent work has included research on care economies and the relationship between occupational segregation of workers and employer power in labor markets. And we're also joined by Mason Hurston-Hort, who's a program director at the Institute of Social Ecology and an organizer and writer in Bellingham, Washington. He is a co-founder of Symbiosis Federation and has previously been the lead organizer of Motor City Freedom Riders. His work, focusing primarily on movement building and ecological philosophy, has been published by the Next System Project, In These Times, The Ecologist, Perspectives on Anarchist Theories, Socialist Forum, Roar Magazine, and the Journal of World Systems Research. And finally, we have Yvonne Yin Liu. She is the co-founder and executive director of Solidarity Research Center. She is a research fellow at the Transnational Institute. Yvonne is a practitioner of research justice with over 20 years of being a nerd for social justice movements. She is based in Los Angeles, California, where the sun smiles on her every day. And with that, I'll pass it back to Belinda, who's going to give us an overview of SRC and the work that's carried out here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, George. Great. So SRC has its roots starting out in the IWW's Survey and Research Committee. Since then, we've gone through multiple evolutions. I won't get into too much detail with that, but we are currently in the process of shifting into a worker self-directed nonprofit model with a sociocratic structure to build out more intentional participation from across our network. So If you are interested in getting more involved with us, we really want you to be involved in an intentional way through this structure. Our mission is to conduct applied social science research on solidarity economies for the public interest, to cultivate direct democracy and social inclusion in workplaces, households, and neighborhoods, and to partner with worker centers and community-based organizations to develop solidarity economies. We carry out these missions, our mission with the following values in mind: solidarity, equity in all dimensions, primacy of social welfare, sustainability, democracy, and pluralism. These are some of our 2024 projects. I'm not going to get into too much detail here because some of our presenters will be speaking to a lot of these. But just to give you a preview, and here are some emergent projects within SRC that are kind of coming together. And again, won't get into too much detail because we'll be hearing more soon. And with that, I will pass it off to George to introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you, Belinda. So we'll have 5 brief presentations on the different projects by the speakers I just introduced. So first up is Mason, who'll be talking about the Municipalism Learning Series. Take it away, Mason.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mason, and I've been involved with SRC through its project, the Municipalism Learning Series. And this is an educational initiative that has a couple different projects nested within it that is about spreading the ideas and organizing practices behind what we call radical municipalism. And you can head to the next slide. And this is, in essence, an idea rooted in the belief that some of the most important and meaningful political interventions that we can make today are at the local scale by engaging in grassroots movements for grassroots democracy from the neighborhood to the scale of the city. And there are lots of different movements around the globe that identify themselves with municipalism, using the terrain of city government as kind of their arena for progressive and visionary politics. But core to our perspective on municipalism is that we're not just trying to do progressive politics locally, but transforming what politics is by bringing in practices of participatory and direct democracy that have real potential here at the local level. And we can head to the next slide. So there are a number of different experiments around the globe that have helped put the ideas of municipalism back on the map over the past 15 years. But these ideas, obviously have a much longer history than that. So in some of our programs and educational events, we've had organizers and thinkers from Barcelona and Camus, Cooperation Jackson, join us to help share their visions and their learning experiences from their own work at the local level to bring a more robust and deeply rooted concept of democracy to reality. Next slide. So we've been offering a number of panels, different kinds of outward-facing educational offerings over the last several years that bringing together different voices that have their own thing to offer for how we might think about building a municipalist movement here in the United States. Next slide. And so the Municipalism Learning Series started off with one of these panels that was aimed to be kind of an intro to what are the ideas and practices of municipalism. And in one sense, that was a really big success. We had tons of people. There's over 1,000 between in-person and online participation. It's been viewed on our YouTube channel many, many more times than that. But this first foray into doing municipalist education within SRC also pushed us to rethink how we're approaching it, because a lot of the feedback from those 1,000 people who participated was they wanted to also have space to engage in more participatory and applied education, having some more guided space to figure out how these kinds of ideas can be made to work in their own particular context. And so that was the backdrop for the main project that I've been involved in through MLS, which is the Municipalism Cohort Fellowship. Next slide. So this is, in essence, an organizing training program that we put together that's not so much aimed at a general audience, but people who are already actively engaged in some kind of local grassroots organizing work to help them think through how their local context requires them to think through different pathways, different kinds of movement building strategies for democratizing the city and building popular control. So this is an overview of the 6-part series that sort of builds one into the next. And we hosted our first pilot cohort of this last fall with 25 people from around Canada, the United States, and Puerto Rico, with I found just a really visionary bunch of organizers. Next slide. So these are some of the fellows that participated the last time around. And because this was a pilot project, we took much of the last year to be following up with participants in this program, get a sense of what was useful, what are things that could be changed for the future, and trying to engage our fellows in envisioning what the next iteration of this program will look like. Next slide. One of the outcomes of this was a project of drafting a municipalist organizing toolkit that we have available on our website in a PDF form and also in print that we're giving as thank yous to donors. They're really beautiful and is the product of the thinking and writing of our fellows themselves. And I really encourage you to check it out. Next slide. And then this fall, a bunch of us from the cohort got together in person on the land base of a few of our fellows in Virginia to think through the future of the program, to get a sense of what role we want to play in the flourishing of a movement for radical democracy here in North America. And as a result, these are the folks who are helping plan the next iteration of the program that we're hoping to bring you next summer. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Mason. Next up, we have Jess, who will be telling us a little bit about their work with the Regional Solidarity Economy.
Thanks, George. Hi, everyone. I'm Jess. I do work with SRC on Regional Solidarity Economy, with also some of the other folks on this panel, Anastasia and Yvonne, and another member of ours at SRC, Ashlyn Dadka. I think next slide. Yes. Okay. So just wanted to share a little bit about what it is we actually do as part of this work. So our work to date has mostly been focused on providing research and analysis support to organizations who are part of the solidarity economy. And so this really means engaging with groups who are looking for ways to incorporate, who are looking for research to be part of their learning and strategizing, but who maybe don't have that expertise in-house. And so we've been doing that, and then also have been engaging with some of the solidarity economy networks here in the US. For example, the US Solidarity Economy Network, we are on the board for that. And then we've been engaging with some folks in California, like all across California, on a short 4-month sprint to explore the idea of creating a California solidarity economy and a network as well. What would that, trying to figure out what would that mean and what would that entail and what would that potentially look like. I think perhaps at this point, I should maybe zoom out and give a little bit more context around the idea of what regional solidarity economy is and what that means for us. So solidarity economy is really a grassroots framework for understanding cooperative economies. Essentially, we're really interested in understanding how to meet our needs while taking active responsibility for the inherent interdependencies and relationships that exist when we exist in community and in society together. And so solidarity economy is really focused on things like shared ownership and decision making, ensuring that people's basic needs are met, prioritizing the well-being of social welfare over, say, like the profit motive, which is what we get under a capitalist system, recognizing that exchange can take place in many different ways in many different settings than necessarily the formal economy. And then also just engaging with the idea and the truth that production is not just for consumption, but can really be done in a way that is for sustainability and reproduction in a more caring way. Some examples of what we would think about a solidarity economy can include worker co-ops. That's primarily who we've been working with, and other types of co-ops, housing co-ops, other things like community land trusts, time banks, credit unions, participatory budgeting, etc. And the reason why we're doing the work that we do is to try to help, is to work to be part of this sort of broader goal of supporting this development of solidarity economies in local areas regionally, and experimentation to the path of really getting an inclusive solidarity economy sort of supply chain. So like making sure that we can meet, so we can engage in the economy sort of like at every step of that cycle in a way that is centering sort of collective action and collaboration and decision making. Okay, next slide. So right now we have 2 primary projects in this program. First is our work with Beloved Community Incubator, and then also some work with Cooperation Santa Ana. And on to the next slide. So with Beloved Community Incubator, I'm going to call them BCI for short. So BCI is a work for self-directed nonprofit in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and they incubate worker cooperatives and provide back-end support for cooperatives and collectives and sort of like any group who would be part of the solidarity economy. And they also organize for worker power and collective control of resources in DC through community organizing and broad-based campaigns and mutual aid. And so earlier this year, they embarked on a participatory action research project that was part knowledge generation for them, part organizing project. And the goal of that work was to really understand sort of the landscape of their area and the community, and to figure out, where are the opportunities and abilities to build out sort of more regional solidarity economy, and to engage the community in the building out of that work. And so they've worked with us, or we've worked with them to provide support on essentially the data analysis of all this really great information that they've collected. So they've, over the course of many months, interviewed about 120 individuals, businesses, and co-ops in the DC metro area. And we've just sort of gotten through and wrapped up last month our analysis. And the work there, I think, really highlighted the challenges that the people in the community there are really facing economically, and their very clear desire for alternatives, but sort of this disconnect between the desire for the alternatives and sort of like knowing what those alternatives are or could be. And so I think, BCI has been planning to launch a phase 2 of this work, which we're hoping to support them with, to include more sort of collective conversations in the community setting, and house meetings, to really drive towards building out some of that strategy for how to build out a regional solidarity economy in the DC metro area. And next slide. And so with Cooperation Santa Ana, and I will refer to them as CSA. So CSA is, they're also a worker self-directed nonprofit. They're a cooperative business development organization, and they, do trainings, coaching, incubation for low-income residents and families in Santa Ana. That's in Orange County in California. And they engage with the community for community organizing and advocacy to really advocate for resident-driven economic development in Santa Ana. And so our work with them is a little bit in earlier stages and sort of starting to develop. I think the first few months have been really trying to figure out what sort of methodology and analysis plan is most appropriate for what we're trying to get at. But I think the general goal here is to really help them to articulate an economic argument for worker co-ops in Santa Ana as part of the local regional development, and to help build this a narrative that would allow for them to advocate for more solidarity economy development in their region as a means to, in particular, engage in it and bring into the fold the communities that have historically been disinvested and underinvested in. And I think I'm at my time, so I'm going to stop there. But I'll end by saying the work has been not only really fruitful and engaging in the research itself, but it's been really lovely to work with these different organizations and see the work that they're really doing on the ground to build out the solidarity economy.
Thank you for that overview, Jess. Now we have Andrew, who's going to tell us a little bit about tribal food sovereignty and SRC.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if my slide showed up. I guess not, but that's okay. Oh, there it is. Great. So I'm Andrew Curley, and I've been working with some other Dene researchers in thinking about tribal food sovereignty, in particular to how it works with water rights, water access. And this is especially important for the Navajo Nation because right now, our tribal government is negotiating or has negotiated a water rights agreement between us and the state of Arizona. A lot of these water rights are abstract and very exploitative understanding of water, not grounded in our community understanding or local understanding. And this is evident whenever you go to a water rights hearing. You'll hear people talking about the things they need for water, which is very different than the way that our lawyers talk about it in a legal political right, as almost like a property right. So there are very different understandings, discordant in some ways, but the perspectives of community members, people who live in areas that rely on water or need water, are not really considered. And so I was approached a couple of years ago by the First Nations Development Institute, and who work a lot on tribal food sovereignty to try to do a food sovereignty project on the Navajo Nation. And much like some of these municipal projects take years and years to get started before they actually become something, this is kind of a long-standing conversation with various iterations going back to probably, I would say, around 2010 is maybe the first time we start to see tribal researchers on the Navajo Nation really start to do local and grounded research on this. So the first report was done out of an organization that I used to work with called the Dene Policy Institute. And that is housed within the Navajo Tribal College of Dene College. And that report was done by somebody named Dana Eldridge, who did this whole kind of she did a number of focus groups in areas where there were a lot of community growing and thinking about how to deal with the effects of colonial diets, food insecurity, diabetes, all that kind of stuff. And then, including a colonial critique in how we think about our food system. And that report was very influential and got a lot of people thinking about this question for the Navajo Nation. And we did a report in 2017, building off of her initial research. This is Marley Lister and Ash, who Ash Key, who ended up working on the Tribal Food Sovereignty project that we're talking about here. Well, not Marley, but Ash did. And here in 2017, we're interviewing growers, people on the Navajo Nation who are trying to recover subsistence growing and traditional crops, and asking them, what do they need? Why do they do it? What do they need? And how do they distribute their food, and try to challenge kind of the prevailing food system that exists within the Navajo Nation and surrounding the Navajo Nation. Now, this particular phase of the project is more concerned about water. It's really focused on water. And so with the help of SRC, as a partner, as a place where we could, organize some of the day in, day out fiscal issues, like where to house our money, and then how to pay for small items here and there that we need for research. It's been very helpful for us to be working with SRC as a home for this particular project. And I think, it's consistent with the ideas of democracy and sovereignty that are being articulated in the course of this presentation. And so, it speaks to the kind of research where research and alternative forms of politics are brought together. And this is what we're trying to do here with this particular project. So we're still in the middle of it right now. These are some initial findings. So a research assistant that's been part of this project, Michael Parrish, based out of Kayenta, that's near Monument Valley. He went around and interviewed local growers, asked them, what is the importance of water for what they do, for recovery of traditional growing and foods sovereignty. And these are in bullet points. There's like long paragraphs that kind of expound on all of these points, but these are the main findings that we have so far, that tribal members need increased access to water. A lot of the water in the area is groundwater. I don't know if you can see the picture behind me is actually one of our well sites. It's out of a place called Lower Greasewood. And that's basically how a lot of people have accessed water for decades. We don't have piped water. We get water that is tapped into aquifers. And tribal and federal governance that fulfill obligation to the people. There's been a lot of suits over the years. So the one that was just decided last year in the Supreme Court about whether or not the federal government has a trust responsibility to tribes to develop water infrastructure. Not surprising, this Supreme Court said no, the federal government does not have that obligation. But and so then we are self-reliant. We have to do this on our own. Maintenance of existing water infrastructure, like the well behind me, other people's pipes leading into their homes, even sewage becomes an issue. And then what is surprising probably for most people on this webinar is this idea of enforcing grazing rights. And so this is like part of the larger strategy of land use, and land use inevitably contains questions of water and food and development. And so, part of the problem is there's an inequality between tribal members with livestock, with how much land they graze, all those kinds of things, which can affect people's ability to grow and utilize local water sources. So, so that's where we are with the project, and we're going to continue to work with SRC. Any kind of support or whatever people are willing to provide helps us do this kind of work. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, we have Yvonne, who will be telling us a little bit about Los Angeles Raw.
Thanks, George, and thanks, Andrew, and everyone else who has spoken so far. So I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on since 2022, which is to basically build a movement for radical municipalism in Los Angeles. So, just for some context, Los Angeles is a ridiculous city. I think it was Dostoevsky or was it Tolstoy that wrote about ridiculous intentional cities, and Los Angeles is definitely one of them. We're very big. We have a lot of people. I mean, we're mostly working class, um, almost 50% Latine, and we have a massive unhoused population. In fact, I would say like a significant portion of our social movement is around providing mutual aid for our unhoused neighbors. And yet, we have out of this population of 4 million folks, we only have 15 city council folks representing us. And this came to a fore a few years ago when there was a pretty scandalous leak of an audio of a recording of a meeting between 3 city council folks and a labor leader about redistricting, where people were just sort of talking about swapping, you know, land and voters as if, there was no oversight and as if there was not really a democratic process or an independent process to do these things. And also, it was blatantly anti-Black racist as well, and pretty much offended every single sort of demographic group in Los Angeles. Um, in contrast, New York City has 51 city council folks. So we have a crisis of representation in Los Angeles. And we are part of definitely efforts to increase the number of city council folks. But if you go to the next slide, what we've been doing in the last 3 years is creating a decentralized network of social movement organizations because we think that there is power currently being built across the 110 or so neighborhoods in Los Angeles. We've been trying to connect all the folks that are building alternatives, that are providing mutual aid, that are building tenant power, and advocating for the abolition of prisons and jails. And then also trying to reimagine institutions, whether that be the city council or how, financing can work. And so our proposition, if you go to the next slide, is that Los Angeles is ready for its municipalist moment so that it's not just about expanding the number of city council people, but it's about building an alternative polity and economy that is directly democratic, that we will transition so that we will replace the current system of racialized capitalism and rule by the power elite, rule by the few into this new alternative system. And the way that we do that is that we're going to grow alternatives wherever we can and fight to shrink this current status quo until we have that transition. And so I think this is a formula that a lot of folks talk about. One of our mentors, our collective mentors, and a former board member, Emily Kawano, talks about resist and build as the sort of strategy. And then Kali Akuno, who's a great friend of our organization, talks about build and fight. And so I think that's sort of encapsulated in the strategy that we're trying to pursue here in Los Angeles. Next slide, please. And so what this actually looks like. So how do we actually build a new Los Angeles? So all of this is experiments, right? So we're trying different strategies out and we're seeing what the data is that comes back to us. So in the short term, we are supporting charter reform efforts so that we can expand city council and set up independent redistricting. That was successful at the county level, and we're hoping that that will also pass in the city level. We're encouraging the expansion of things like participatory budgeting and the sort of innovation around citizens' assemblies and just generally non-reformist reforms, which is basically reforms that help to ameliorate the situation in the short term, but also bring us closer to what we desire in the long term, which is ultimately a replacement of racialized capitalism in favor of direct democracy. So in the short term, we work on these non-reformist reforms while we also carry out political education, efforts to build alternative counter institutions. We've been running a People's Movement Assembly basically since that crisis of the leaked audio came out. And in general, we are trying to create, sort of prefiguration of the sort of world that we want to live in. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we're working on currently right now, we've been engaged in last year doing a study in how we should structure ourselves. So we studied how different directly democratic movements, such as the CNT in Barcelona, Spain, such as the Zapatistas, such as Podemos, also in Spain, and Barcelona and Camus, how did they structure themselves? And we're taking that to heart because we believe that it's important to build a base. So it's important to build assemblies at the neighborhood level in order to then confederate and scale across the city. So our current strategy to do that is to first study power. So we are planning a series of study groups that will prepare sort of like technical manuals on different institutions within our city and what's the strategy that we can use to build popular power within that. So for instance, water, like Andrew talked about that vis-a-vis the Navajo Nation. In Los Angeles, our water is not from here. We steal our water from indigenous folks in the Owens Valley, which is further up near northeast of us in the Sierra Nevadas. And so we're going to unpack the history of how that happened, and then who currently has the decision-making power, and how can we create a popular power movement to contest how current decisions are being made. And so that's one, sort of area of work, the power series. We're also going to be looking at land. We're going to be looking at how the charter was founded in the 1920s, and it's only been, reformed only once in 1999. And that was in response to the San Fernando Valley wanting to secede, and it really didn't, sort of address the crisis of representation that we have in our city. The second project is around land and liberation. We have a massive housing crisis, and we don't have enough leadership among city officials to really address it adequately. Folks instead who do not have homes in some cases are being criminalized and swept up, as opposed to there being permanent and affordable homes being provided. And so we are attempting to map out vacant land and unused buildings across the city, understand who their ownership is across the 110 neighborhoods. And then bringing together these two pieces, the power series and then the land mapping, we are going to help to provide and catalyze neighborhood assemblies in the different neighborhoods. And that will hopefully then lead to a movement for popular power. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Now I'll hand it over to Anastasia, who's going to tell us a little bit about the care economy work.
Great. Thank you, George, and thanks to everyone else who has presented. We can go to the next slide. So I think this week I probably don't have to explain the problems of the care economy that we face here in the United States and also globally as well. So part of the sort of impetus for this care economy circle coming together is to sort of rethink some of these problems with care that we have in a capitalist society, but to rethink them beyond just, say, the market or beyond, say, just the household, and to think more expansively about sort of solidarity economy initiatives that can intersect with the care economy. So thinking about new forms of care that go beyond that sort of private, capitalistic, alienated form of care that has become the norm in our society. So to give a very brief overview of the outline before I go into detail, part of the initiative for bringing together a care economy circle was to sort of start more cohesively bringing in different projects that were touching on this theme. And at present, what we are working on right now is sort of convening our emergent care economy circle, but we also have a current project going on right now with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And we are thinking for the future about different ways that we want this care economy circle to be operating in terms of analysis and sort of incubating solidarity economy care projects. We can go to the next slide. So a little bit more detail on what we've done so far. So in early 2024, many members of SRC expressed interest in the care economy as its own thematic circle. In May, we began to meet to talk about our individual care research projects and potential care research projects, as well as literature reviews. And then through July and August, we continued to meet to develop sort of a shared analysis and a shared literature review and sort of figure out and articulate what our shared programmatic vision will be for the care economy circle. Next slide. So what we are thinking at this moment is that our current work as this sort of emergent circle is to build our shared critique of the care economy, to landscape what the alternatives are as far as like current existing solidarity economy initiatives go. And then to think more forward towards incubating radical experiments with new forms of care that are unalienated forms of collective and community care. We can talk more about that in the next slides. Oh, go back. Thank you. So what are we doing at present? So the Care Circle right now is working on developing a care economy essay. So we are working on developing that shared articulation of how we critique the care economy and our diagnosis of the current system and how it fails to meet our needs, and thinking about more collective forms of care. We actually recently submitted an abstract to the International Association for Feminist Economics annual conference as a way to begin sharing our analysis in the academic sphere. A current project that we have that is well underway is a collaboration that we are currently doing with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So we began this work in September and we plan to wrap this up by March. And what this has been is a landscape analysis of the current state of direct home care services in the US, focusing on 3 key states, where we want to understand what's going on with sort of how these things are provisioned in the market, including the role of things like consolidation and private equity investment. And part of our work is to look at that from the point of view of how is this going to how is this going to have an impact on organizing and workers? And we're also looking at things like the flow of funds of things like Medicaid dollars as they flow through that system. So that's current work that we're currently undertaking and we are currently working on, and we are hoping to have that wrapped up in March. We can go to the next slide. So we are thinking very much so about the future, about where we want this sort of emerging care economy circle to go, because I think this is one of our newer sort of set of project themes. And so we're really working on trying to, again, like we said, develop that shared critique and analysis. This also includes sort of soliciting feedback from community members and practitioners who are already working on these sorts of solidarity economy care initiatives. And our goal sort of in the next few months is to develop a sort of white paper for public dissemination on our analysis of like the current state of the care economy, but also to start landscaping solidarity economy practices of care. And just to share a little bit about what that means, we're thinking about mapping things like mutual aid projects that focus on care, community care, clinics and healing circles, forms of democratic psychiatry and peer support, decarceral forms of care, care co-ops, and so on. We want to then sort of take these bits of research and turn them into popular education tools, because for us, our goal would be disseminating this for the longer term goal of possibly incubating collective care projects that we hope would help to sort of transform this care economy into something more solidaristic and community-based rather than the sort of for-profit capitalist model that we have now. I think that might have been our last slide. Yes. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you,
Thanks so much,
Anastasia.
Anastasia.
Hand it off to my co-facilitator, Belinda.
Thank you, George. Awesome. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Okay, now we're going to have 25 minutes for responses from each panelist. So you'll each have 5 minutes to respond to the percolating discussion. And we'll go in the same order that we went in for the presentation. So Mason, if you'll kick us off.
Sure. I think I would just want to kick it off as more some open question for other folks. But one of the things that I'm especially interested in is the relationship between a for lack of a better word, political movement, something focused on institutions of participatory democracy at the neighborhood level, and an economic movement, something focused on building out institutions of economic democracy, of self-provisioning by our communities. And I just love to hear more thoughts from other folks on the panel about some of the relationship between those, what's potentially symbiotic or sources of meaningful movement building overlap between these. And I'm happy to loop back around in a bit as well.
I think that means I'm next and maybe can just directly respond to Mason's question. I don't know if I'll need the full 5 minutes, and I'm happy to give some time back to Q&A for the folks who've joined us today, the attendees. But I think that's a really great question, Mason. And my immediate response is I think that those two things are like inextricably and intimately related, because ultimately it's sort of like the question of like who structures the economy. It's people, and then but it's also institutions. Like institutions are so core to the rules of the economy, right? And so I think that there is a component of the economic work that can be really bolstered and in conversation with the political work, because while we're sort of independently doing that experimentation and trying things in community and in the economy, there are ways that local institutions can be advocated to support that type of experimentation. Especially, for example, some of the work that we're doing with Cooperation Santa Ana, I mean, they themselves are involved in the California Regional Economic Development Project. And that's public funding and public dollars to understand how to sort of like build regional economies for Californians. And the work there is trying to figure out like the experimentation on the economic side, but then figuring out how on the political side we can build sort of political support also for that type of experimentation, so that there's not only like political support for it, but also like funding support for it, because while we're experimenting in economics, we still have to live in a capitalist society, and we still all have to eat. And so trying to figure out ways to resource the economic experimentation, and then also vice versa. I mean, I think so much political power can be tied to economic power. And so how can we sort of like use the economic experimentation as a means to build some of that economic power at the political level too?
Thank you so much, Jess. Up next, we have Andrew. Would you like to share some responses?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mason. I think this is a very important question, and it's hard to know where to start actually, because there's so much so much background, especially for my answer, where I'm thinking about how has a drive among many community members to do local empowerment, as it's called here, as a political ideal, how does that like translate into economic power and a critique of the capitalist system, while at the same time, speaking to some of the things that are happening in solidarity with other communities in a political arena like the city, which is very different from a reservation. So so for central to the question that we're trying to research about food sovereignty is operating within is us living and operating in a background dominated by capitalism. And that's a broad concept, so we got to talk about what that means and how does that look day in day out, and how it affects people's livelihoods. Is that there's for decades been an emphasis on getting commodity foods, stuff that's produced at an industrial scale, flour, wheat. I mean, these even go back to the years of imprisonment at Bosque Redondo, and the way that the U.S. Army distributed provisions to a people that are like being brought in against bayonet and threat of violence. So like this kind of economy was forced onto us at the through the barrel of a gun. And so over years we've started to consume things that are produced all over the world, so we're incorporated into a broader capitalist system that affects our the ability of people locally to continue to do what they're doing, or even for us to want the things that we can produce locally. And so where it comes back to political power is, well, can you disaggregate some of these decisions that are often like concentrated in the tribal government when they're partnering with outside institutions who is speaking on behalf of the tribe? And this goes back to legislation in the 1930s and the whole history of federal Indian relations that is too much to go into detail about here. But basically, community members have been wanting to have kind of a local sense of control, things that reflect more traditional boundaries, maybe things that are defined by clan or other kinds of kinship networks, and that's a little bit different than municipalism and other kinds of definitions of the scale of the local, but it's still, in fact, it may be even more present in some ways. And so people's identities are very much rooted into the place in which they inhabit and where their family has been living for many, many years. And so there's this real sense of local empowerment, right? That's the political rhetoric that's used that I think reflects a lot of what we're talking about here. And part of those, in some legislations and changes in tribal laws, have been to try to give those community members economic decision making, going back to Mason's question about how the political and economic work together. And this is called the Local Governance Act, passed in 1998, and it gives chapter houses, which are these sub-political units in the reservations, the ability to partner independently with groups to set aside land for land use purposes, to even, basic things like clear land for cemeteries and stuff like that. So yes, it's all there. Within the desires of community members, and community itself can be broad and needs more definition, but I'm just saying it for like at the scale of the local, that we introduce this topic, like the idea that we introduce this topic with. Anyway, so I've said my 5 minutes worth of stuff. So sorry if that was vague for everyone.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I was unmuted this whole time. You guys all heard me cackling. I'm so sorry. Okay. Oh my gosh, that was embarrassing. Anyway, so the question is, sort of what's the relationship between sort of building economic power and then building political power. So I snuck in a slide as the folks before me were talking. So if you, Belinda, if you go to the next slide, please. Oops. Oh, shoot. It may not show up because you're already sharing your screen. That's okay. That's okay. So I was actually going to say that, I think early on, like, I don't think that us as political actors versus us as economic actors, like, they're not distinct. We are all these things at the same time. I remember years ago, I did a case study where I had a chance to speak to Hamad Khan, who is now in LA with Stop LAPD Spying, but had been with the South Asian Network before that. And he was like, we don't, when we leave our house, we don't stop being a householder, to become a worker. We are still a householder, and we're still bringing these identities with us into all these other spheres of life that we move in. And so I think early on in SRC, so this ridiculous, like, Microsoft Paint graphic that you all see right now, is something that we came up with when we were first started, which is this idea that we're trying to build democracy in these spheres. We are starting at the local level because that's the level in which we can build authentic relationships, but we don't just stop there. We then confederate and we scale up and out from there. But it's this idea that, we're trying to, liberate folks both, in the households, in the workplace, and in the neighborhoods. So I think that, maybe, like, disciplinary wise, there's a difference between, like, there's a whole science of politics and there's a whole science of economics, which, I would question whether it's a science or not, but but I don't think that these things are actually distinct. I think we're living our lives, they're messy, and what we can advocate for is having the power to make these decisions ourselves. Um, and I think it's unfair that Mason got to go first because he got to set the question. But I would say I'll just kick another question into the circle. Like, given that our world is going to dramatically shift, or maybe it's already shifted, I'm not sure when it started, but January 20th is definitely a marker of some sorts. How is our work going to change? And what is our work in response to? Are we still living in a neoliberal world? Or are we living in a new age of authoritarian nihilism, as Wendy Brown says? Or fascism, the big F word? Thanks.
Thank you, Yvonne. Anastasia, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks for that, Yvonne, because I think that's something that's, like, been on my mind when thinking about the care economy stuff too, is just like there's going to be a radical shift, right? In the wrong way, thereafter, right? Which means that sort of forms of community and self-provisioning start to become really important for survival and for, like, self-defense, right? I'm going to read a question that is in the Q&A in the chat. So Elias asks, does your vision include importing models from other regions such as Italian social co-ops or solidarity co-ops in Quebec? I ask this because we don't really have social co-ops yet in the US. Yeah, that is such a great question. And also, like, really great examples, especially of, for example, the care co-ops that exist in Quebec, which are really interesting to think about. And one of the themes in our care economy circle that's come up quite a bit as an area of interest that we want to focus on is on mental health care and decarceral forms of care. And a lot of the thinking on that is influenced by some of the Italian experiments in democratic psychiatry and deinstitutionalization that took place in the 60s and 70s. And so we've been thinking a lot about how things like peer support and democratic psychiatry, how we can learn from those models and sort of build toolkits around those models for ways of sort of community provisioning of these forms of care that don't intersect, for example, with the carceral system, because that's one of the big problems when we're talking about things like mental health care, for example. So that was a great question, and I'm excited to, like, chat more about that and write more about that with our care circle and other folks that want to join in on thinking about these experiments. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And we do have some extra time, Mason, if you want to loop back in and share a response since you just opened with the question.
Sure. And maybe I'll try to weave that back into Yvonne's question as well. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with respect to the relationship between the solidarity economy and the project of attempting to build democratic autonomy is um, the former is sort of a condition of being able to meaningfully have the latter. And there's so many various anti-colonial movements of the last century that had their main thrust focused on establishing political independence from the colonial power, but still having sort of more revolutionary minorities within those movements, trying to point or teach their comrades that if we establish political independence but don't control our own economy, then that is still held in the hands of capitalists in their among their colonizers. They're not going to be able to exercise meaningful political sovereignty. And I think that same quandary faces us when our political terrain is about the local versus um, uh, the larger scales of the nation state, where if we can't build a sustainable and self-sustaining democratic economy on the local and regional level, our ability to claim political power for our cities and our institutions of participatory democracy is going to be really constrained. And I think that is sort of the part of the shift in terrain that we're facing in the coming years, where forces in the federal government and in lots of places around the country in the state government are openly hostile to democracy and social justice on a local scale, and where we will need to be developing movements that have the resilience to be able to sustain themselves, not just organizationally, but in terms of food, water, housing, etc. These are the things that we need to build and control at a local scale, to build a resistance movement that can weather these coming years.
Thank you so much, Mason. And we shared a couple reminders in the chat, but we're asking, we have seen some questions come in. Please hold your questions for now. We will get to them soon. We're going to make an appeal, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So with that said, I will pass it off to Yvonne for the appeal.
Thanks, Belinda. So, I think everybody knows that the world is really going to change drastically. I mean, we're going into some really dark times coming up. And this is also a difficult time for grassroots research groups such as us, such as Solidarity Research Center, to operate. Just 2 weeks after the election, a lot of you folks might have been following this and tracking this, but a bill passed in the House. It's dubbed the Nonprofit Killer Bill, HR 9895. But basically, it will give Trump the authority to strip any nonprofit of its 501c3 tax exempt status if it's deemed a terrorist organization. And what is actually how that is defined is really going to be up for the incoming administration to define. A lot of folks see that as a way to attack a lot of sort of anti-genocide, pro-Palestinian groups, but we think that that's going to expand. And I think, folks that are doing work around solidarity economy and direct democracy will also be under attack as well. So we are trying to raise $35,000 by the end of this year so that we can continue our political education and our solidarity research under a new regime. And I will, so your support is really important for that. We are grassroots, so we don't accept large sort of, corporate grants or monies. We do really rely on grassroots fundraising. So I hope that you will consider, if you have the resources and the means to donate to support us, you can go to solidarityresearch.org, and there's a form on that website where you can put in your donation, and we really, really appreciate that. And I will pass it to Mason to talk about what that 35,000 would go towards.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, so we have sketched out a budget for this coming year for the Municipalism Learning Series, and we have two big ideas for this kind of programming in 2025. We're going to be structuring it as sort of a 101 track, open to the public, nuts and bolts organizing training and guidance that is in the form of these open panels. We're trying to get a whole bunch of people out to learn some of the basics of building deeply rooted grassroots organization, neighborhood by neighborhood. And then secondly, we're rolling out a kind of retooled, revised, improved version of our cohort fellowship, which, as I alluded to before, is really more of our 201 track. We're trying to develop a visionary and strategic approach to leveling up these kinds of community organizations that is aimed at people who have already planted their roots in their community and are attempting to figure out how to navigate their context and build power at the local level. So we're going to be running another cohort of this organizing training program next summer. The fellows from the previous year are sort of taking the lead of shaping it, identifying who are the people who should be participants in that program, and shaping its materials. So we are hoping to be able to stipend participants in that for those who have income restraints that make it really challenging to spend a significant amount of time in our program sessions, to make this a more accessible program for people from underrepresented and marginalized communities to be able to participate with their full selves, to be able to arrange childcare or take off work and other things that are so often barriers to deepening and growing our movements. We're also hoping to be able to gather the fellows in person on either end of the program. And we found as an outcome of the retreat that we did in September that was such an essential part of deepening relationships and getting people engaged in the work that we're doing over the long haul. So this is kind of a breakdown of some of the key pieces of what we're seeing for the municipalist education in 2025. And I'd be happy to answer any questions folks have in the Q&A too.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mason. Great. And then I'm going to pass it off to George, my co-facilitator, to facilitate the question and answers.
Thank you, Belinda. And it's really nice to see so many folks hanging out with us for over an hour now. And so as promised, we're going to open up a space to invite folks to ask questions to our speakers about any of the projects, about SRC, how to get involved, the kind of contributions and the work ahead. So as folks, you can either raise your hand and I'll I'll call on you and unmute you to ask your question directly, or you can write your question in the Q&A section. I still see John's hand raised, so I'll invite John to the space. I want to ask a question. John, do you still have a question? If not, we can also start with questions that have been written up, or want to take a minute to write up your questions, you can do that, or just raise your hand. I see also David's hand just went up. So David, would you like to ask a question?
Unmute. I'm in,
Yeah,
right?
we can hear
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Hey.
Yep.
Yeah, I just want to say I've been trying to connect with you all for a while, and I did take the course on the Black Panthers, I guess in the spring or the summer. And the reason is that I have been working on building a cooperatively owned housing and real estate portfolio in West Baltimore for some time now. And over the last couple of years, we got a significant amount of funding from Seed Commons. So like the piece that Yvonne was speaking about identifying the vacant land and the distressed neighborhoods and the distressed properties, that part of it we're really kind of getting good at. The part that I'm really struggling to find energy, bandwidth, resources is convening the communities that we're working in around this idea of highly localized power, and the idea that the city of Baltimore, which is also, I'm just going to not say bad things now, is a difficult city to work with. That the city of Baltimore does not represent the interests of the poor and the highly oppressed neighborhoods. Getting folks to convene around that and understand that if you own the land and you own a significant stake in the local economy, you can achieve municipalism and then ultimately enter communalism. That's like hard to get out in the streets and preach and convene if you're spending all of your days just trying to acquire the properties and renovate them. So all that to say, like I just want to find more ways to engage. It sounds like you all are way ahead of the thinking and the philosophy and the history than we are, but we do have the land and the buildings and hope to keep building on that. And that's it.
Thank you, David. Is anyone doing work in Baltimore want to jump in or add anything?
But Belinda, do you want to jump in? Because you're doing a lot of work in Baltimore. Sorry to put you on.
Yeah. So I organize with Housing Our Neighbors in Baltimore. We're a homeless advocacy group, but we've been involved in a lot of related work. Like we were really instrumental to the establishment of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, David.
Yep.
And I know of some other folks who have been doing some of the work that you're describing to thread that piece of like building the community power and participation through the Barclay Old Goucher Neighbors group. They are an effort to try to kind of form a community association that intentionally excludes developers. In Baltimore City, there's a vast network of community associations that are a lot of people are involved in, but they kind of inevitably end up getting taken over by developer interests. And BOG is an interesting exception to that. So yeah, I think there's it would be interesting to connect that work to yours, David, because I think within BOG and related projects, the piece that we've struggled with is the part that you're working on, which is mapping of the vacants and ownership of the properties and things like that. So kind of exciting to hear you say that. But yeah, I'll share my email in case you want to be in touch following this.
Yeah, I definitely will. We have 28 properties. Did I say that already? And we're in Sandtown, Winchester, and Coppin Heights, and Midtown Edmondson, and Park Circle, that North Avenue sort of corridor. Yeah, and we have turned that vibe where the workers and soon the tenants are the developers. So like not letting outside developers come in and commodify, but turning the folks that are already there into the stewards of the neighborhoods. So I will email you. That's really great. And I already emailed you, Yvonne, because I really think hearing you say what you're trying to do in Los Angeles, we should talk some more too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. I will say that, I think, and I think this speaks to the question that Matt asked in the Q&A about there being a lot of talk about education and research, which is important for improving our strategies, but what are practical opportunities that we're promoting in order to get people involved in building solidarity economies based on what we already know works? So, I mean, I think I have a, what do you call it? I'm biased. Because I'm a big old nerd, so I like doing education and research, so that's me. But I think it doesn't stop there. I mean, I think in order to build power, we need to organize people. And so a lot of how we approach doing sort of research is with the ethic of solidarity research. So it's not sort of strictly research as we typically think about it, as like someone sort of sitting maybe, removed from a community or removed from social movements, but it's really embedded research. And I think a lot of us have different ways of thinking about this. I think workers' inquiry is something that Anastasia talks a lot about. We have another colleague, Ashlyn, who thinks about convivial research, which is another way. And I see that there's folks on this webinar like Kevin Van Meter, who's done incredible work around workers' inquiry, doing a shout out to you right now. And so I think that like everything that we do, it is an inquiry process, but it's a form of organizing and base building. So I would say, and as a student of like, social movements, I feel like what has actually worked in the past, what has actually worked to topple kings, what has worked to change economic, orders has been powerful social movements. And so I would say that what we are trying to do is also build social movements, build strong and powerful social movements, starting at the local level, but not limited to the local level, then federated up. And thinking about what that looks like, even on the international scale, if we think about internationalism from below. So that's what I would say. And yes, David, that's incredible. I feel like we in Los Angeles have a lot to learn from what you've already done in Baltimore. I'm looking forward to connecting, but I think, building a people's movement assembly is something that we talk about in our Municipalist Organizing Toolkit that Belinda and George worked really hard on. So I think that might be a good maybe section to take a look at. Check.
Yeah, totally looking forward to that. And also, you all are much smarter than me, so I don't have the great words, but since I participated in the Huey Newton study, I've been listening to Black Against Empire, and I feel like as I am walking the streets of Baltimore and doing this work every day, I'm trying to pick up upon what Huey Newton and the Black Panthers were trying to do with respect to intercommunalism and like thinking in like real world study of the history. So they great accomplishments like the breakfasts for the kids and the healthcare and all that, but never like pivoted to understanding that ownership of the actual economy is the way that you could achieve something permanent and really sustain all of these other efforts that they were trying to put in place. And Emiliano Zapata like got it that it was all about the land, but never got it that he needed to unify with other folks that were similarly minded across Mexico and then maybe across other borders. So anyway, every day I'm thinking like this. So I'm looking forward to seeing how you all who have done these intellectual studies going to help me advance that in Baltimore.
Thank you for that. Thank you for generating this conversation, David. I just wanted to also read here a comment or question by someone in the chat who actually reminds me of what Sada Shakur talked about with in relation to practice, right? Because theory without practice is as empty as practice without theory, right? So this is a comment and question by Chapman in the Q&A box. So there's been a lot, quote, there's been a lot of talk of education and research, which are certainly important for improving our strategies for change. But what about practical opportunities your organizations are promoting to get people involved in building solidarity economies based on what we already know works, end quote. So perhaps maybe we could do a quick kind of run through the same order that the panelists presented in. And if you wanted to give a few sentences about the practical work on the ground that folks can plug into, or you'd like to promote. I think we start with Mason.
Well, the kinds of trainings and educational stuff that I'm involved with is not specifically about solidarity economies, but doing grassroots neighborhood organizing and people's assemblies and different kinds of counter institutions that are more on the power politics side of things than the economies. But I can, I guess, answer the question in that frame. So what we're going to be attempting this coming year is to structure our panels as more of a coherent series. It's kind of taking folks from A to B to C through the process of building out these spaces of neighborhood self-governance, participatory decision-making, and things like that, where for sessions 2 and 3, would ask that people at least watch the recordings of the previous ones to be able to get the fullest experience and learn the most that they can from these, because we're attempting to orient the program not just in terms of like theoretically how do we situate this kind of movement building within the broader revolutionary process, but as aimed at being more of an intentional skills transfer for people who are excited about the ideas and want to go out into their own communities, their own contexts, and put these into practice. So that's kind of the guiding spirit of what we've got planned for these in 2025, and would love to figure out ways where we can adapt that to be more actively supportive of people trying to put this into practice.
Thanks, Mason. And Jess, would you like to share any sort of transformative practices your organization is engaging in?
Sure, yeah. I think for the regional solidarity economy work, right now we're really project-based, and I would kind of tie back to the answer and comment that Yvonne gave. I'm also, like Yvonne, a big nerd, and my background has been much more in the research space than it has been directly in the organizing space. But I think from where I approach the work is really thinking about how we can like best use research in service of these types of movements and in service of the work that does need to get done. And I think it just goes back to, again, what Yvonne was saying. A lot of the work we're doing with BCI and Cooperation Santa Ana is one, like led by them and the communities that they're working with. They're the ones sort of setting up the research questions and setting up the goals of the research. And our role has been more so to help sort of facilitate how to get to those answers in a way that feels true and authentic to the community members themselves. And then, it's really been about supporting the work that is already ongoing. I think there's a lot of work that's happening in the space already. And so I think the role that we've envisioned for ourselves, particularly as folks with more research backgrounds, at least for me, has been to think about how we can support the work that is already ongoing. And, with BCI, that's including doing research projects that are not only about knowledge creation and knowledge development, but are also part of the organizing strategy, right? Like doing interviews with people is also about engaging the community, helping to bring exposure to the community about what the alternatives are, and trying to sort of engage the community in the work that's being done and figuring out how to how that work can also best serve them. And so it's not just, as Yvonne said, a bunch of academics sitting in an academic room, even though I am in an office, in a department, in an academic space right now. It is about trying to bring that and put the research in the space of the community and have it be community led. And so it's tough because we definitely, I think we all, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I certainly, and I think we all do subscribe to the idea that you have to have both the theory and the practice. And sometimes it's about like utilizing the skills that you bring in that dynamic.
Thank you for that, Jess. So Andrew our panelists had to step out. But Yvonne, I know you've broken down the Los Angeles for all, but is there anything that you'd like to add to that question about practice?
No, I don't think so. I think just what I'd shared earlier about how we think about solidarity research, it's basically a form of organizing through sort of like an inquiry process. So I think and we see social movements as the sort of mechanism for which we can build solidarity economies, and we can also build powerful, like liberated zones as well.
Great, thank you. And finally, Anastasia.
Yeah, to build off of what Yvonne sort of just said and what everyone else has said so far, I think that one of the things that SRC offers is this ability to be a hub of knowledge as well as practice. And so for a lot of us who are on the research side, we're trying to learn from existing practices. But I know in my own work with my other hats on, doing community organizing or other forms of mutual aid or union organizing, sometimes it feels like you're kind of starting from scratch when the reality is you aren't. It's just that when you're in a radical movement, things get lost, and that's kind of because of the forces we're up against, right? You lose that sort of knowledge, you lose some of that institutional memory. And I think one of the things that SRC can offer is sort of a hub for connecting those practices and those ideas. So I think like that's part of sort of like what we're trying to do, is sort of be able to do that sort of work. So.
Great, thank you, Anastasia. So I see a comment here I'm gonna read out, but the quote, "The significance of relationship has been mentioned several times. One observation I have noted in my work is an increasing need for developing skills in relating, which underpin the ability and experience of authentic relationships. For example, I have been surprised where I've seen polarization seep into regenerative circles of which I am engaged. In the work that each of you do, how are you weaving in skills of relating?" This is a great question. I recognize that relationships are essential to sustaining efforts and movements, especially as difficulties such as increased external scrutiny and pressures will most likely increase, end quote. So yeah, great question. So yeah, if any panelists would like to answer this question on how you deepen relationships and the kind of work that you do.
George, do you want to answer it maybe through the work that you've done through the Patterson People's Assembly?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can kick off the conversation. Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. It's as mentioned, it's quite significant. I mean, I believe it informs. It's the foundation for any of the work that we do. It's the base. Like any structure, right? A well-established and concrete base is the foundation on which the structure can flourish and build up, right? So deepening this takes a lot of work. It's a slow, intentional process, right? And must be done really considerably with a lot of consideration, which is why Belinda and I were talking about this and why I've appreciated the municipalism project that we were involved with, because it takes off in a very open and dynamic space to allow for independent creativity and dynamic processes to flourish in the locality, right? In the places in which they're emerging. So it's not a top-down imposition, right? And so it's led by local projects themselves. And so it looks differently in different contexts and different places. And so only those, I believe that only those communities can tell you what those relationships look like, right? They're predicated upon their unique histories and their unique contexts. So the work I've carried out in North Jersey with the Patterson People's Assembly was, again, a long process, and it took time. There was, times where we took one step forward and two steps backwards, or we took side steps, right? And so you have to manage, contingency, and as folks have mentioned throughout this conversation, overcome the sort of barriers of participation that are very unique to different communities. And only folks on the ground that are experiencing and living that day to day, I think, have the best knowledge to carry that out, right? So I think it's there's no prescription, right? So I think it has to come out organically based on where you are, the kinds of history you share with the community you're building. So I think that's one. If there is one prescription, it's that there is no prescriptive sort of way of deepening relationships, because again, the communities and the localities have their own unique histories and contexts, right? Yeah. Would anyone else like to add anything to that question? Relationships. Are there any other questions from the attendees?
I'll just say really quickly about relationships. I mean, I feel like that was the work that we did for 3 years. Our first 3 years with the Los Angeles People's Movement Assembly was to build relationships. And I agree with George. I think it's probably the most important thing that we can do as a social movement is to connect with each other, because everything about racialized capitalism is about dividing us and to make us feel like we're alone, we're alienated. And that, whatever sort of troubles that we go through are because of it's our own fault, as opposed to seeing it as part of a structural thing. And also from not seeing the collective agency that we have to change those conditions. I think within the left, we often like to splinter ourselves off. Like there's that famous Monty Python scene where people argue about whether they're part of the People's Party of Judea or the Judean People's Party. I mean, so the left likes to bicker among itself. And for us, because we started off with social movement organizations, we had the spectrum of the left, and we had the Stalinists, we had the anarchists, we had the sort of Bernie bros, and people don't listen to each other. So I think a big part of what we tried to do is just to actually listen to each other. And I think that is really just through making space for people to connect, making space, like facilitating people. I think good facilitation is really helpful. Making opportunities, giving people opportunities to connect with each other and to talk to each other.
Thanks, Yvonne. And I see a question from Hannah about a space for younger emerging organizers and researchers in SRC. It's a great question. There's a lot of workshops, as David mentioned, and reading spaces, learning opportunities that SRC provides throughout the year. One of them is the Municipalism Learning Learning Series that Mason introduced in the beginning. We're in the midst of organizing the second cohort, and that's a great space for emerging organizers to connect with folks, ideally in their respective regions, but also learn about the history of different municipalism projects, not only in the United States, but across the globe. So always a lot of opportunities. Signing up to the newsletter and connecting with SRC is a great space. And Yvonne also shared a link for folks interested in working with the organization as well. So we're getting close to the time. Are there any other questions before we move to closing space?
I want to go back to the question about relationships a little bit. I think, I really appreciate the question, because especially with really uncertain times coming up, it's really, really pressing. And just some observations of like things that I've seen that have helped. Definitely what Yvonne mentioned of making space for like multiple tendencies to coexist and learn from each other can be very helpful. I think that helps a lot to make it less about like who is right, and more about okay, what commonality do we have, and where are we aligned, and what can we do with that is like really helpful. But then I think another piece that's really important is that, especially when so many people are struggling and under just intense pressure and just dealing with really difficult stuff, there's inevitably going to be challenging feelings that surface in our movement spaces, and conflict and disagreement. And I think one thing that's really, really important is to make space for that to come out and surface and be processed, but in a way that can be generative. So I think sometimes it can be easy to like panic if someone is really upset in an assembly space or a community space, and it can feel like, oh no, like now we're all mad at each other. And but I think if we can, as facilitators especially, kind of come prepared to hold challenging feelings that might come up, it can really help to just be able to affirm, like, maybe the exact way someone brings something up is like, might be challenging to hear, but can you look, beneath the maybe words that are harsher at the underlying concern, like, oh, this person is afraid someone's going to be left out, or oh, this person is concerned about basic needs of people in their community or something. So I think like the more we can challenge ourselves as facilitators to like really ground in empathy for like, can we see through the harsh words down to like what's the like core need that's coming up there, and affirm that, and then shift the space into like trying to hold that and like move to a more, like supportive place, that can be helpful. And I think there's also some frameworks that can be supportive here, so that before there's a difficult moment, your group has already had a chance to think about like, oh, how would we want to navigate this in advance? Like, I really like Antanya Lee's concept of principled struggle um, that she describes. That's like just kind of, like a framework for disagreeing with each other while also reminding ourselves that we are disagreeing for the purpose of arriving at like a greater unity. And like, can we disagree with each other with that goal in mind? So yeah, I think those are some things that I've noticed have been helpful in spaces that I've been part of.
Thank you for that, Belinda. Any other responses? Anything else folks would like to add? I think this is a good place to kind of move us into closing the space. So I'll hand it back to Belinda for kick us off.
Cool, thank you so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. Great. So our communities are facing truly unprecedented levels of uncertainty, precarity, and threats. And I'm really grateful, in the midst of that, for the role that the Solidarity Research Center is holding in carving out this really unique space to conduct and disseminate militant research that supports organizers to launch and sustain independent, locally based organizing projects that can do that work of both defending our communities while building the worlds that we need. I think it's always been important, and it's especially important now in the times that we're moving into. So yeah, I think it's really unique, really necessary, and I hope you'll support our work. And I'll pass it to George to share some wrap-up logistics and next steps for how to get engaged.
Thank you, Belinda. Yeah, just to flag some things for folks and some reminders. Before that, just thank you all for attending and spending nearly 2 hours with us. We're really grateful for that. And thank you for your questions and comments. So a recording of this will be online. It can be found on the website, solidarityresearch.org. We also have a survey, and so you can subscribe to the organization with the contact information here on the screen. Of course, this is a fundraising event, so we encourage you all to support us if you can, and share the fundraiser with your networks. There's also opportunities to apply. And also a reminder for the next upcoming event. It's the Community Defense panel, which is going to be on January 7th, and the time's listed here on the screen. And with that, and again, thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day, evening. Thank you so much.